Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Barron, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Barron.
Welcome back to Early Returns, a podcast about law and politics. I'm your host, Jan Barron. The producer of our show is Jody Mayer-Piazza. Early Returns has taken a little bit of a recess in order to have the voting and counting of votes in the 2022 election concluded. Yesterday, the Georgia Senate runoff election was held, and the vote counting has ended, which ends the 2022 election activities. Many of the candidates, especially those who ran for re-election as incumbents, have been, in fact, re-elected. Yesterday's result in Georgia means that every senator of either party who ran for re-election was re-elected. Almost the same thing occurred in the governor's races. Every governor who ran for re-election was re-elected, except one, which was the governor in Nevada. And then in the House, there is some change. First of all, we're almost a record number of retirements, a large number of retirements, or candidates who wanted to run for another office. But those who stood for re-election to the House, by and large, were re-elected. There were some exceptions. There were a handful of candidates in New York, almost all Democrats, as I recall, who were not re-elected. And the same was true in Florida. In both New York and Florida, redistricting had some effect on those campaigns. And also, there were numerous Republican candidates who retired or lost in primary elections because of their votes in impeaching President Trump. But otherwise, if you were a Republican or a Democrat and you wanted to get reelected to the House of Representatives, 97, 98% of you were reelected. But one of the changes, and really the only substantive change one could argue, is that the House of Representatives is now controlled by the Republicans by a 5-vote margin, which happens to be very similar to the margin last term when the Democrats controlled the House. Now, that's the summary of what happened in politics, but this podcast is about law and politics, and I wanted to spend a little time in this episode discussing what went on legally during the 2022 election. And I'm privileged to have with us two lawyers who were very active in those campaigns and legal disputes during 2022. They are Jessica Furst Johnson and Jason Torchinsky. They are both partners at the Holtzman Vogel law firm. Jessica and Jason, welcome to Early Returns.
Great.
Thank you, Jan.
Get us started, as usual. I want to make sure that people know who you are and what you did and how you wound up doing what you do. So tell our listeners, Jessica, starting with you, where you grew up and how you gravitated to D.C. and political law.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us, Jan. This is super fun to participate in. I'm from Sarasota, Florida, and got the political bug quite early and did campaigns prior to law school and during my undergraduate time. And to be quite honest, I was a press secretary on a campaign and making $22,000 a year and thought, this might not be quite sustainable for the rest of my life, but I really want to continue to do politics. And so I had set my sights on DC, but this was back in the time when you could go to law school just because law school sounded interesting. And that's definitely what I did. I enjoyed reading and writing and learning. And so I went to law school and wasn't even aware at the time that political law, campaign finance, election law was a practice area, and was exposed to that through an internship I had while I was in law school. So had the privilege to come up to DC and start working at a firm right out of law school practicing campaign finance and election law. And that led to an 8-year stint as general counsel at the NRCC, and then 2 years as general counsel at the NRSC. And this is where I find myself today. So it's been definitely in my fiber to do politics, and to be able to find a way to merge that with the law has really been a dream.
And just for the benefit of our listeners who may not be familiar with the acronyms, NRCC is the campaign arm of the House Republicans, the National Republican Congressional Committee, although formally their legal name is NRCC, and NRSC is the Senate Republican counterpart to the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Well, while Jessica was doing her thing in Florida and Washington, Jason was doing his thing in another part of the country, but still wound up in the same place. Jason, how was your path to political law?
So I grew up in South Jersey and came down to Virginia for college. And during college, actually took a semester off and interned full-time on a presidential campaign while I was in the middle of college. And I came back from that. I worked for a congressional campaign, interned for a political consultant and a lobbying firm. And after college, sort of wrestled with, should I go work for a governor who might run for president, or should I go to law school? And ultimately decided to go to law school, and thought I went to law school because I was going to come to DC and be a lobbyist. I was sending my resume to lobbyists in DC, and a guy that I had worked with on the presidential campaign saw my resume and said, "What do you want to do?" And that led to a law clerk position at the Republican National Committee, where Jill Holtzman and Alex Vogel and Tom Josefiak, three of my partners, were the chief counsel and the two deputy counsels when I was in law school. And I worked with them from that time, with the exception of my stint in government. And I've been at the firm now for 17 years doing nothing but political law.
Well, let's start addressing some of the things that you did in the last 2 years in the aftermath of the 2020 election, which certainly presented a lot of legal issues. What was going on in this most recent election cycle? Starting with you, Jessica, what were the 2 or 3 legal issues that kept you busy during this recent cycle? And were any of them new, or were they kind of issues that would pop up in every election cycle?
So I think there were certainly the run-of-the-mill issues that pop up every election cycle in this practice of representing campaigns and committees. You know, contract law, copyright law, lots of political compliance related to communications and fundraising solicitations, and all the things that form the basic blocks of this practice area. But there definitely were some new things that I think we first saw in the 2022 cycle that we'll definitely continue to see, I think, over the next few cycles. And for me, I think about that in a couple of ways. First, it was really interesting to see this growing intersection between like privacy law, cyber law, and politics. Specifically, campaigns and political committees now are becoming potential targets, like anybody else who uses the internet, for hacks and fraud and unlawful impersonations. And so, you certainly saw political entities and campaigns who unfortunately had to deal with these sorts of situations. And this is something that I think is unfortunately becoming more common, but that we'll continue to see. And so for me, learning to obviously deal with these situations when they unfortunately do happen, but more importantly, to learn how to advise clients to inoculate themselves against these sorts of crimes to the extent that they can. Obviously, there's bad actors and things are going to happen, but how can we better protect ourselves against these sort of bad actors and educate the teams and political people on how to protect themselves, particularly online? And then relatedly, the privacy law intersections will continue to be interesting with respect to data, and specifically looking at state laws like the recent activity we've seen in California and Nevada, where they're really trying to regulate the way data is stored and shared. Data is an incredibly important currency for all sorts of political actors. And so thinking critically about how these laws and others like them will impact political committees and candidates was something I spent a good deal of time on this cycle. And I imagine that's only the start, and that will continue to increase over the years. Relatedly, state law changes were something I spent a lot of time focusing on this year, because in the wake of COVID, where, we were largely shut down as a society in various parts of the country, states saw necessary to implement some changes to the way elections were conducted. 2020 obviously was impacted as well, given that was, the first year of the pandemic. But in 2022, we really got to see sort of some of the long-term effects of these changes, and continuing to educate people in the regulated community, PACs and party committees and individuals on these changes, remind them that the changes had occurred and how to operate in this space. That was something that was new, and it'll be continually interesting to see how many of those changes stay. as President Biden has said, we're now out of the pandemic. So are these changes going to have staying power now that the pandemic is no longer the impetus? Lastly, I'd say the FEC has been more active than it's been in recent years. We went through a period, where the FEC did not have its full complement of commissioners. For those of us practicing in this area, that may mean that things are a bit quieter when it comes to the FEC, and that doesn't seem to be the case currently. We've got a full complement of commissioners. They do seem to be busy and interested in regulating. And so for us, responding to that and thinking about that and advising our clients about their activities has definitely kept us busy.
Well, if I could, I'd like to follow up on a couple of these points that you've raised. First, I'm interested in what advice do you give to clients regarding the cybersecurity issues? You say that you inform them of the risks of what's going on, the hacking. What do you say they can do about that to protect themselves?
The first piece of advice is probably the most obvious one. You need to train your staff and your people, your consultants on phishing and, what those emails might look like that they get and how to respond to them. A lot of the political committees and campaigns I work with do lots of tests on their staff by their IT teams to make sure that their staff know what to do and what not to click on. It would be probably surprising to most people how often very well-educated professional people, fall for these sorts of schemes. It truly is not limited to unsophisticated elderly populations that we often hear about. So I think training staff on how to be really wise when it comes to interacting with their emails is the number one thing to do. And it's so easy and not something that we often do. I think number two is, have a plan in place for what happens if, God forbid, there is a hack that you have to deal with. And that plan involves a lot of elements, but some that I can think of most prominently. Obviously, if there's a sense that someone's in your email or on your server, in your internet space, then you want to stop emailing, right? While you figure that out. So having everyone's cell phones and maybe an alternate email address handy so that communication doesn't have to stop. You would be really surprised at how often, entities and organizations are taken down temporarily because they truly don't know how to contact someone if they can't email. So having that information handy, knowing who you would call in terms of a firm or an IT organization who can help you kind of figure out what actually is going on and what needs to be repaired. There's some really talented, wonderful partners out there, and having that partnership at the ready is so critical important. And then understanding that all of these states govern what your responsibility is to certain donors or people you've interacted with if there is potentially some sort of hack or breach. And these laws, like all state laws, they're all different. They all have different obligations for you as the entity that has had this compromised situation. And so knowing what those laws are, or knowing who to call to figure out what those laws are, because a lot of times you have a time window in which you have to notify donors or notify these folks that may have been compromised through your server. And so having all of that ready so that you can work really quickly and minimize the security breach, I think is incredibly important.
Do you ever have to deal with federal law enforcement agencies as a result of a cybersecurity invasion or hack?
Yes. And I will say, when I was at the party committee, they were quite proactive, various branches of federal law enforcement, to reach out to us and say, unfortunately, this is a part of politics now. And I think that they have caught wise to the idea that if they can reach out ahead of time before something happens and make sure that we have their contact information if there's any concern, if anything, that's going to help build confidence that everybody's watching and that everybody's involved, and that voters and people participating in the political process, be it that a donor or a committee, can have confidence that the federal government is there to help. I was actually quite surprised by that reach out when the first time it happened, but it was very helpful and did provide a little bit of comfort to know that they were there and watching and available.
Well, thank you. Well, Jessica referred to state law changes. I know that you've been involved in some of those legal issues. What, in addition, has taken up your time in the last 2 years?
So, in 2020, I spent a lot of time dealing with litigation over election rules, whether I was defending states or challenging states or filing amici briefs. And what shifted in 22 was instead of litigating over existing laws, we were litigating over the newly adopted laws. Red states and blue states all adopted various changes to their election laws, and almost every statute that was adopted brought a legal challenge from somebody. So we spent a lot of time defending those laws, attacking those laws. It was quite the challenge Jessica, I think, was dealing more with the candidate education side. I probably spent more time on the litigation side of those. And then the other big thing that kept me busy in the 2022 cycle was we just got through the 2020 census and the census data and all of the redistricting work that came along with that, because everything from, the U.S. House of Representatives to state houses, state senates, to city councils and school boards and county commissions across the country all had to be redrawn so that the populations of those various districts were equalized. I wound up working in a lot of states around the country, sometimes for the government, sometimes for outside entities, but redistricting took up a significant portion of my time in the 2022 cycle. It's a decennial thing. It happens every 10 years, but in the intervening years, there's a lot of legal changes. We had some Supreme Court opinions over the last 10 years. We had state court opinions over the last 10 years, and figuring out how the legal changes over the last decade affected how you drew the lines in 2022 was quite a task.
With respect to the House of Representatives and the redistricting there, of course, that doesn't affect every state. I mean, obviously, there are single district states that are unaffected by the census. They are what they are. But of the remaining states where there would have been a redrawing of the congressional lines, how many of those remain active as a legal dispute?
There are currently about 75 currently filed state or federal lawsuits about redistricting in something like 22 states. So there is a lot.
And that's just the House. We're not talking about state legislatures.
So that statistic covers federal, state, and local.
Federal, state, and local. So
yep.
22 states. But not all of them would involve a challenge to a House congressional redistricting, but so there would be fewer than 22 in terms of the House. I'm trying to think of what effect is this going to have going forward to the 2024 election. Are we going to see even more lines redrawn before the 2024 election? And if so, how many? How many states are in jeopardy of having additional changes?
So there are probably 10 states that have litigation going on over their congressional districts. And this is all across the country, literally from Utah to New York to Florida to Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, all have active litigation over congressional districts. And actually add Michigan to that. Off the top of my head, all have active litigation over congressional districts.
In some of these districts, the elections that we just had, the 2022 elections, were conducted in newly drawn districts that are still under challenge in court. You might share with our listeners this legal concept that federal courts sometimes leave challenge district lines in place because it's too proximate to the election and might cause confusion. What's that all about? And how many districts do you think were involved in that type of situation?
So one of the challenges this redistricting cycle that was new, and once again, because of COVID and a couple of other things the Census Bureau was doing, the Census Bureau missed their statutory deadline to deliver the redistricting data by something like 10 months. They're supposed to deliver it in January of the year following the census, and they didn't deliver it until August. And so the consequence of that was legislative sessions in a lot of states that were anticipating having their data and drawing in the first half of 2021, which would have allowed a reasonable time for litigation over maps leading into 2022, didn't happen. The legislatures across the country weren't given the data by the Census Bureau until the middle of August. Try to get a whole lot of people, like state legislatures that aren't in session together in August, and that's kind of hard. So a lot of legislatures came back into special session in the fall, be it September, October, or even into November, to try to set their new maps for 2022. So what that meant for courts, whether they were state courts or federal courts who were facing some of these challenges, usually if you want to get quick action from a federal or state court, you ask for something called a preliminary injunction. In a number of these cases across the 75, preliminary injunctions were sought. And for the most part, the judges that had those preliminary injunctions said, you might be right on the law, but I just don't have time, given the election calendar, which I, as a judge, can't change because the federal election date is set by the U.S. Congress. I just can't deal with a new map before 2022. So a number of those cases that I mentioned across the federal, state, and local redistricting cases, the judges just sort of said, I hear you, but we're going to get to it in a sort of more ordinary litigation process. In some cases, injunctions were granted, and then stays of those injunctions were granted by higher level courts. That happened in Florida, in North Carolina, in Alabama, in Louisiana, and in other places, the lower courts just denied the stays. And when appeals were sought, the higher courts didn't grant stays. But for the most part, in most of the country, with the exception of North Carolina and New York at the congressional level, the adopted maps as adopted by the legislatures or the commissions went into effect at least for 2022.
Putting on your magic hat predicting things, what do you think will change between now and the 2024 election campaigns, which will certainly get started in about a year's time? How many of these?
A lot less than that.
Well, the campaigns have started, but if you're going to run for the House of Representatives, you've got to pick the right district.
That's right.
What do you predict will be the possible scope of change, and how would it affect partisan composition?
I think both parties are going to look for places where they have advantages, either in litigation or in legislation. Democrats, for example, just picked up what we call a trifecta in Minnesota, where Democrats now control the state house, the state senate, and the governorship. Since the 1970s, every redistricting cycle, Minnesota has had a divided state government, and the state Supreme Court has appointed a special panel of multiple judges who have picked Minnesota's congressional maps. Now that the Democrats have full control in Minnesota, they could well go try to redraw Minnesota. Democrats in New York passed a map that was widely viewed as an egregious partisan gerrymander. And because their state constitution has a partisan gerrymandering claim, the state highest court, which in New York is the State Court of Appeals, the New York Court of Appeals enjoined the map that the Democratic legislature had passed, even though all of the justices on that court were appointed by Governor Cuomo. So there'll probably be maneuverings in New York by Democrats. They are already making moves to try to change the composition of their state Supreme Court to try to set a court that would be more receptive to their gerrymandered maps. In North Carolina, the partisan majority of the state Supreme Court that selected the last congressional map flipped from 4-3 Democrat to 5-2 Republican. In Florida, Democrats are challenging a map that was Governor DeSantis had vetoed the initial map and then signed the second map. Democrats have an active state court challenge to that map, and there's another challenge in federal court brought by some other groups to the same map. And then we have the Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama cases that are all basically awaiting the outcome of the U.S. Supreme Court decision in the Alabama redistricting case. A 3-judge panel had ordered Alabama to redraw its congressional districts, and the Supreme Court stopped it. In Louisiana, a single judge ordered Louisiana to redraw, and the Supreme Court stopped it. And in Georgia, the judge said, I think you're right on the law, but I don't have time, so I'm not going to enjoin Georgia's districts for 2022. But the outcome of all three of those lawsuits will very much depend on what the Supreme Court does in the Alabama case that was argued this fall. We're all awaiting that decision.
Sounds like you were quite busy with redistricting, as you said, and I will acknowledge that you spent some additional time when you had spare time away from redistricting, advising clients on other legal matters. That was the big obligation on your part. But you also mentioned litigation in the state law changes and Jessica mentioned that. What kind of changes prompted the litigation? And what's been the result? Were they big changes or sort of changes along the margins? Can you give us some examples?
In some states, they were along the margins, and in other states, they were much bigger changes. But let's start with Nevada, for example. Democrats took full control of the Nevada government after the 2018 elections, and following 2020, where there was all kinds of litigation over vote by mail and absentee balloting, Nevada entirely changed their law, mailed every single active voter an actual ballot. So in Nevada, there's no longer, if you want to vote absentee, there's no longer an absentee ballot application. They literally mailed every single person who was registered to vote mail ballot. And what that meant was when it came around to election time, when you were trying to, do the most you could to get your candidate supporters' ballots submitted, it was a lot easier because you didn't have to go through the ballot application process. You didn't have to drive people to polling places. You could literally knock on people's doors and say, hey, you got that ballot? You want to give it to me? And the Democrats allowed that to happen.
So in that Nevada change, was that challenged in court?
No.
No, and I think that's in part because Nevada is not the first state, obviously, to go to all-mail elections. And it's something that we've been seeing over the last decade or so. To reiterate what Jason said, I think your question about, are these small or big changes is a great one because I think it depends entirely who you ask. I mean, for these political consultants who have been used to conducting elections, like let's take Nevada, in one way, they have their tried and true methods to win elections. This really upends everything, when folks are voting by mail. And we saw that there. And then other changes across the country, whether it was relaxed rules for who may vote by mail or when somebody may request an absentee ballot or ballot trafficking or ballot harvesting, depending on which side of the aisle you sit on, who may return a ballot that someone else has voted and where and how many ballots and when. There you have to produce voter ID. I feel like that's an issue that's been controversial for quite some time in the election law space. But all of these changes, while they may seem insignificant and frankly are often made to be insignificant by the folks pushing for them, they really do result in some quite momentous changes for the folks who are running for office and advising others on how to run for office, because it changes everything about the way that you campaign.
Yeah, I mean, we saw various states in 2020, there was a lot of, let's call it ad hoc adoption of drop boxes in various places. Following the 2020 election, a number of states went and passed regulations or rules on drop boxes to try to make them more fair and more uniform. There was a lot of litigation over drop boxes this cycle. The other thing that happened in 2020, on top of the pandemic, the Postal Service was basically overwhelmed. And there was a lot of litigation in 2020 over ballot return deadlines for absentee ballots, in large part because the Postal Service couldn't receive ballot applications, send ballot applications back to the local officials, and then have the local officials get the ballots out to people in time to have the Postal Service return them. I'll give you a great example. Mm-hmm. You file your absentee ballot application online the Friday before the Tuesday election. So even if the local election official gets that ballot in the mail to you on Saturday, when they're in their office the Saturday before the election, crunching with everything else they have to do, the Postal Service picks it up Saturday afternoon, delivers it to your house on Monday, you get it after work, and now it's Tuesday morning. If you put that in the mailbox, it's not going to get to the registrar by the close of polls that night. So, a number of states that had the Friday deadlines for absentee ballot applications reacted to contact that they had from the Postal Service, which in 2020 sent letters to about 15 states saying your absentee ballot request deadlines just don't match with our delivery standards. And so a number of states adjusted their deadlines for requesting absentee ballots. States adjusted the hours of early voting, the days of early voting.
The recount threshold in Arizona, they actually changed the recount threshold, which is quite important when you have close races, as we saw there.
Yesterday, a state court ordered automatic recounts in 3 races, I believe 2 statewide races and 1 state assembly race.
In Arizona?
Arizona.
I was struck by how few recounts there seem to be currently. In the House of Representatives, there's one race in Colorado that's, because of state laws, subject to an automatic recount, but the loser in that race has already conceded.
Right.
That's right.
And now you've pointed out a couple of races in Arizona. Overall, it seems to me that I'm struck by how few recounts there are, even though we've had a fair number of relatively close elections. But it's such a contrast to 2020, right? Where, in large part because of Trump, everything was being contested, all this litigation, people were filing lawsuits all over the place. And yet we don't seem to have that repeating itself in these off-year election results. And also, I was struck particularly yesterday with the Georgia runoff election, how quickly, generally, the results have been coming in, how quickly the votes have been counted, except in your typical virtually all absentee ballot states, California, Oregon, Washington, all that stuff takes them forever. Since we were just talking about all the changes that have been made in state laws over the last couple of years, and we've had what seems to be a fairly well-administered election without a lot of controversy, is this a good sign that the election administrators, for example, are really being careful? They all know they're going to get scrutinized, and if something goes amiss, they're going to get sued. And have these changes actually not resulted in more confusion or more controversy?
So I was at a conference one time with a bunch of election officials. My co-panelist said, I'd like to start our session with the election administrator's prayer. He said, "Dear God, please don't let this election be close." And that was how he opened our presentation. And I think that's true of election officials. Close elections draw a lot more scrutiny on how the process was conducted than elections that are further apart. 2020 was really unique in terms of post-election litigation. I don't think at the presidential level any automatic recounts under any state law ordered in 2020. Most of that litigation happened under, a lot of states have a recount process, and then following a recount process, what they call a contest process. The contest process is used generally when there is fraud that affects the outcome of the election. And I have been practicing election law for basically 20 years now, and I have never once actually filed a contest because the number of elections where there is actual fraud that affects the outcome that isn't already caught by the election officials in some way is super slim. I mean, I've defended these, right, where my candidates have been challenged, or I wind up representing registrars or state governments, but I've never actually filed a contest on behalf of a candidate. So the Trump contest filings in 2020 were unique, to say the least, none of which were successful, I point out. But I think that led people to think that this is like a normal process that normally happens. And frankly, with the exception of 2020, there's not usually post-election litigation on that kind of scale.
I would say, though, that, too, what I think is interesting is that it's very easy to conflate the canvass from the recount, especially in states where it takes a real long time to count. And so what we saw in 2020 also, we saw some of that in 2022 in Arizona, particularly in California. But, it just takes so long to find out who won. And as has been discussed ad nauseum this cycle and this year, the longer it takes, the more your voters tend to start saying, what is going on here? Why don't we know? Something must be amiss. And so I think for election administrators, they have an increased interest in trying to figure out how to get this done accurately and quickly. Even yesterday, I think Governor Ducey in Arizona publicly pushed to figure out how we can speed up the election results in Arizona. Even as an outgoing governor, he recognizes that this is critical to maintaining that trust in the electoral process. So I agree with Jason. I don't think that there were less or fewer recounts this time than there were in 2020. I do think that election administrators now are put on notice, unfortunately, that they are going to be under an intense spotlight during the post-election process, whether that's just a canvass, which for the listeners is just the process of counting, the ballots. So whether that just takes a long time and becomes controversial in some way, or whether it does go to a recount, which is highly unlikely. And in my experience, while working canvasses or recounts, fortunately, you don't often see actual fraud or malice from the election administrators. Typically, it is they're trying to do a great job under an intense spotlight, working within the construct of laws and guidance that aren't often exercised because you just don't have close elections all the time, right? So oftentimes they're just not familiar with these provisions, and they're also dealing with the media, which I know is not common for them. Oftentimes where you do have problems, it's more because someone isn't quite sure what they're doing, or they're just, nervous about the spotlight, and not really because they're trying to do anything untoward. Therein is the rub, right? So how do we craft laws well enough to provide speed and accuracy in our electoral results, and train our election administrators well enough so that they feel confident walking into what has become, as of late, a quite combustible situation?
And I'll add to that, in an environment where elections are run by humans, right?
Right.
So Maricopa County, printers failed. I was in an election a couple of years ago where I was handling not a recount, but a canvass process, where this is an older system, but the voting machines actually had memory cards with batteries in them, and the batteries failed. So you couldn't load anything off of the memory cards into their central tabulation system, and they wound up having to retabulate everything again. And again, not malice,
Nope.
but things happen.
No. Well, and that's an administrative, mechanical
Right.
issue in terms of how you physically conduct the elections and the tabulations, and that raises questions. But one of the things that both of you mentioned was, the changes in the state election laws that were made in the aftermath of the 2020 election and the experience under a pandemic. I think it's fair to say that the most controversial changes at one time were made in Georgia. They were alleged to result in suppressed participation in the election, to the point where Major League Baseball moved their All-Star game from Atlanta to Denver in 2021. It was so allegedly blatantly racist and suppressive. And yet we've now had a general election in Georgia last month, and we had a runoff yesterday. And in both instances, there was record turnout and voting in both of those elections. And I believe also in the primary election, which was conducted earlier this year. You don't hear about Georgia's laws being unreasonable and unconstitutional and racist. And in fact, we've had one district court opinion from a challenge to these laws that basically rejected the challenge and said, you can argue about whether you should have such a provision of law, but it's not illegal, it's not unconstitutional. And now we know it doesn't suppress turnout. If anything, it may contribute to the turnout. What's your conclusion about Georgia? What was the fuss all about?
Well, I think we don't like change as humans, right? And so I think part of this boils down to change makes everyone nervous. We push back on things that we think are different and that we don't really know what the outcome will be. I completely agree with you that I think in this particular instance, 2019, there was a very high profile election in Georgia, and Georgia is quite a purple state now. If I'm predicting, I would say, Georgia and Pennsylvania, they're the new Florida. I think they're the states we'll be watching. And so I think there was a partisan spotlight shown on Georgia, and everyone kind of retreated to their corners. You might remember, Stacey Abrams hadn't even conceded the gubernatorial election. So I think there was a lot of Democrat angst toward Governor Kemp, and anything he tried to do, they wanted to fight back against. I found it particularly interesting that, when the move for the All-Star game to Colorado happened, if you dug into Colorado's voting rights, some might say it's more restrictive than Georgia's under the new law. So I do think there was a bit of partisan posturing there, which both sides are guilty of, certainly. But, you're right. At the end of the day, you have a Republican win at the governor's seat and a Democrat win on the Senate side. So clearly the voters, it seems, were able to have their way and express what they wanted. And that took place. And so, I think we'll continue to see this partisan fighting over election law changes because you don't like change and when we're always skeptical. And I think some of that is healthy, but the partisan rhetoric in Georgia was certainly at an all-time high.
Now, that said, Stacey Abrams, the nonprofit that she founded, Fair Fight Action, brought a lawsuit in Georgia following the 2018 elections in Georgia that ultimately went to trial in the summer of 2022. And about 2/3 of the claims had been dismissed by the judge prior to the trial. And after the trial, the judge wrote an almost 200-page opinion rejecting the rest of her organization's arguments about what was wrong and unconstitutional about Georgia's laws. So I think there was a lot of, in Georgia, I think there was a lot of hyperbole and alarmism from the left. Mm-hmm. And frankly, most reporters believe that she's right, but the facts turned out to be wrong. And to give you a sense, like even that judge that dismissed the Fair Fight Action case, that was a sort of liberal-leaning judge appointed by President Obama, and he threw out everything. They spent over $21 million on that litigation, and the federal judge dismissed everything and said Georgia doesn't have a problem here, not under the Constitution.
Well, let's turn to one other aspect of campaigns, and that's money in politics and fundraising, both in 2020 and this recent election, 2022. We're seeing astronomical amounts being raised and spent. And part of the reason is the ability of candidates to raise really impressive amounts of money online from small donors. I think it's fair to say the internet has really put some power into campaign fundraising, but also big dollar fundraising. And the rules, particularly for federal races, are such that the candidates themselves can only raise money from individuals and from other political committees, but only in limited amounts. So if you're an individual who wanted to give a lot of money, or you're a corporation or a union or some active organization, you'd have to find some alternative, effective way of giving money and having it spent to promote or support a candidate or campaign or a cause. And that usually is done or increasingly done through super PACs, which is a post-Citizens United phenomenon in the campaign finance system. What are your views about what's going on in fundraising? Why is it, and what does it mean for the people who participate, whether it's a candidate, whether it's a company that wants to donate money to some super PAC? How is this all going to be viewed going forward by the participants?
Well, I think you are right that super PACs are really driving a lot of the money in politics. I mean, the preliminary numbers for the 2022 cycle show that $2.3 billion were raised by super PACs for this cycle. And the number was $1.5 billion in 2018. So the last midterm cycle. So that's certainly an increase and attributable to much of the growth of money in politics. I think that being said, the internet and social media, I think gives your average person a window into what's going on in DC and in the state capitals and on the campaign trail. And it feels to me like there's so much more interest in politics. There was previously, because information is disseminated differently and more quickly and more accessible. And so I wonder if individuals, because they have more access to information, they have more interest, and therefore they're more interested. They want to put their money where their mouth is and participate in the process that way. Online fundraising is certainly a large part of what's going on. I know on the Republican side, when I started in this business, I had $1 for every time I heard a political consultant say, well, our people just don't give online. That'll never work on the Republican side. They don't give online. And that's not true at all. WinRed, which is the Republican platform for digital fundraising, I think they crossed the $2 billion threshold for the end of this cycle and just being in existence for about 3 years.
And their Democratic counterpart is Act Blue.
Correct.
Which has raised, $5 or $6 billion through their fundraising, correct?
Right. But they've been in existence for, I think close to 15 years now. And so that just goes to show that was something that, is still very much developing on one side of the aisle. The FEC just last week released a notice of proposed rulemaking and some guidance on internet disclaimers, some of which apply to internet solicitations. And they've been working on this for, close to a decade. We're really seeing the internet continue to really revolutionize the way that the regulated community is able to campaign and be involved in politics. And I think that certainly it's changing the way that your average citizen can interact with politicians. And we are seeing, since Republicans are somewhat catching up, I can now say that, both sides of the aisle, regardless of your political persuasion, online fundraising is really something that's exploding. I see no end in sight. I see that to continue to happen for sure.
Are there legal compliance issues that make this all very tricky or for fundraisers?
Absolutely. The Federal Election Commission would say that they're still playing catch up to figuring out how to regulate all of these new platforms. I mean, one of the big issues in the internet disclaimer guidance that was released last week was how to expand the definition of a public communication on the internet. It used to be just via email. That was the only way that folks communicated and raised funds. That's certainly not true anymore. How do you put a disclaimer on TikTok? What's the next platform that's going to come up in 2 years that we haven't even thought about now that is going to be used by regulated entities and that we're going to have to come up with disclaimer guidance for that? So trying to be flexible and nimble in an industry that is continuing to explode and expand is really a challenge. And certainly on the state level as well, many of these states look to the Federal Election Commission to figure out what their guidance should be. Many of them end up not regulating at all. And so it's really an area where oftentimes when a client calls and says, how do I comply here? There may not even be anything to comply with. And so you're either looking at the FCC guidance to just ensure that you're disclosing, who's paid for what, and calling it a day, or you're just trying to read between the lines of perhaps an advisory opinion or some other guidance that's been issued to figure out what would be required. But working with the internet is definitely a challenge for compliance professionals in the political space.
One of the things that occurred in 2020 during the COVID experience was basically a suspension of the national party conventions. Are those going to occur in 2024, or did that experience likely change any method by which the party is going to nominate their presidential nominees?
I think the presidential conventions will be back with a vengeance in 2024, and we'll go back to, like Jessica said, we as humans are resistant to change. We'll go back to the old ways. And the other problem is 2020 was a bit of a challenge for the conventions in terms of process, because the state laws for general election nominations of presidential candidates by their major parties in almost every state presume that there is a national convention taking place. So if the parties tried to eliminate their national conventions, it would require a lot of state law changes to change how the party nominating process for their general election presidential candidate happens. So I don't anticipate a lot of change in that process anytime in the near future.
Well, whatever happens, I think both of you are going to be very busy in the next 2 years, advising clients and others on compliance and litigation. And we look forward to having you back on early returns to see how the process is going. But to conclude our session and our episode, I do want to solicit from each of you any recommendation you might have for a book for our listeners, whether it's related to law or politics or something you think really deserves some attention.
Since we're coming up on the 2024 presidential cycle, the best book I've ever read about presidential campaigns was published in 1992 about the 1988 presidential race. And it was a book by a gentleman named Richard Ben Kramer, who passed away in the last couple of years. But he wrote about the process of the presidential campaigns, not from the sort of like, how do we do advertising and marketing, but like looking into the bios of each of the presidential candidates and really sort of figuring out what made them think that they could be president of the United States. And it was an absolutely fascinating book. And in the introduction, he described a presidential campaign as a single, mindless, all-consuming quest. And he talked about what made these candidates want to bend, and he said, bend their lives and the lives of everyone around them into this single, mindless, all-consuming quest. And that was probably one of the best descriptions I've ever read of a presidential campaign. And again, the book's called What It Takes by Richard Ben Kramer. I highly recommend it.
I remember that book well. Thank you for the recommendation. As you know, I was the General Counsel of the 1988 Bush for President campaign, and some of the things we did are mentioned in that book. It was a good read, even if it invoked some of the things that the Bush campaign did that were of interest to me. I was quite interested in what the other campaigns were doing as well. How about you, Jessica? You got a recommendation for a good read?
Yeah, I'll throw two at you because this is a podcast about political law. My political recommendation would be The Thumpin', which is written by Naftali Ben David. It's about Rahm Emanuel and how he ran the DCCC when he was executive director there. And I think it's always interesting. He had a reporter, as I recall, follow him around. And I think when they peel back the curtain on the political side, it's always worth taking note. So I think that is basically required reading for any party committee campaign operative, The Thumpin'. And then as far as a personal read, I just finished Solito by Javier Zamora, which is the story actually of his immigration from Mexico back in the late 80s. And I just think with this being such a hot topic, it's a really interesting perspective and a memoir and an important story. And so I highly recommend that read as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Jason, for being on Early Returns. I want to again thank our producer, Jody Mayer Piazza, and we look forward to our listeners joining us on the next episode. Have a good day.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Barron. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.